I'm Brad Carmack, the author of Homosexuality: A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You're welcome to get my book for free by downloading it from my blog, bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You may also obtain it in hard copy. You can purchase it from me by sending an email to homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. We're going to continue building a moral case for LDS same-sex marriage with reason number 16, which is because we supported polygamy. I'll begin with a quote from Elder Dallin H. Oaks. There's an irony inherent in the churches taking a public opposition opposing homosexual marriages. The leading United States Supreme Court authority for the proposition that marriage means a relationship between a man and a woman is Reynolds v. United States, which is an 1878 Supreme Court case. In that case, in which the U.S. Supreme Court sustained the validity of the anti-polygamy laws, the court defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman. The court's stress in that case was on one. The modern relevance of the Reynolds opinion is its reference to marriage as being between a man and a woman. The irony would arise if the church used as an argument for the illegality of homosexual marriages the precedent formerly used against the church to establish the illegality of polygamous marriages. Okay? Now, I would say it's generally appropriate for an institution such as a church to take a stand on a consequential issue that's so important as defining marriage, provided they're consistent. The LDS Church, for instance, has a qualified or vitiated foundation from which to declare that marriage is only between one man and one woman. Why? Because in the recent past they officially maintained a broader definition, specifically one man and one woman, or one man and several women. Polygynous marriages had only two genders but more than two partners. Now the official LDS Church position supports only two genders and two partners. Obviously, at first blush, this manifests a glaring hypocrisy, and it seems that we run the risk of mimicking the type of treatment that our own polygynous ancestors received when we get together and legally and sustained in an organized way oppose same-sex marriage. Having so recently received such bitter government persecution by defenders of traditional marriage for practicing an unpopular minority definition of marriage, one might reasonably predict, if you didn't know the actual case, that the LDS Church would support, or at least refrain from opposing, those who, due to their own deeply held beliefs, also desire government recognition and societal tolerance of their practice of an unpopular minority definition of marriage. Instead, you observe organized opposition. And so, the reason this is reason number 16 supports same-sex marriage in an LDS context is because such would, of course, manifest tolerance for the unpopular minority of practice of same-sex marriage by supporting it. Okay, so that's reason number 16. I would also, number 17 is called presuming the principle behind the practice is a hazardous idea. We're going to touch on a couple themes that were noted in the previous clip. But I would start out by noting that one way to learn about God and His attributes, which is a vital part of mortality, is to look at His behavior, to see how He interacts with His children. And the record we have of His dealings with His children are recorded in Scripture. Since Christ founded and guides the LDS Church, it's reasonable, for instance, to infer some of His attributes from His practices in the Church. For instance, you see LDS bishops who lovingly counsel members who have sinned and help them to repent. And so the principle behind this practice is that God is also a counseling, forgiving, and loving person. However, presuming the principle behind the practice is a learning approach to learn about God that is fraught with peril. And there are some good reasons why that's such a dangerous practice, to try to understand God based on practice in His church. Let's take a look at the church's political neutrality statement. They say the church claims not to endorse, promote, or oppose any political parties or platforms, to allow its church buildings, membership lists, or other resources to be used for partisan political purposes, or to attempt to direct or dictate to a government leader. But we also know that the church uses its church buildings and other resources to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment said, it was pretty brief, it just said, the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It said that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of the article, and that the amendment shall take place 2 years after the date of ratification. That was the Equal Rights Amendment, and the church used its buildings and other resources to oppose it. In 1978, there was a First Presidency statement that says that we believe the ERA is a moral issue with many disturbing ramifications for women and for the family, and could result in an increase in the practice of homosexual and lesbian activities. So there was a little bit of, and some would argue a large component of homophobia and opposition to homosexual conduct that was part of the church's anti-ERA stance. But the point is that through the church's opposition to ERA and through their support of Proposition 8, you can see what a potent force for political activism LDS women prove when the cause is cast in terms of loyalty to the church and defending the family. And we can try to infer some principles about God's attributes from that practice. The church advocated against same-sex marriage in Proposition 8-like amendments around 1998 in California, Hawaii, and Alaska as well. They had both overt and covert advocacy against the ERA, and which, like their support of Proposition 8, arguably tipped the scales of a close race. And would seem to indicate the principle that God opposed the gender equality measure of the ERA. But in the midst of campaigning against the ERA, the church felt significant community or moral consequences that directly affected the interests of the church. Remember, that's the statement that underlies when the church will get involved in the public square on an important issue, especially one like an amendment. But during this time, they also felt sufficiently to speak out against deregulating of airlines. The First Presidency asked all Western congressmen to vote against the deregulation of airlines. Arguably, that's not very much a matter of faith or morals. Of course, perhaps the interests of the church really were threatened because it was a significant stockholder in Western Airlines, which was threatened at the time. In any case, the advocacy stands in stark contrast to the aloofness of most LDS leaders towards the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And the reasons given to not get involved in that movement was because it was a political issue. And so if there are significant community or moral consequences that justify getting involved in opposing the ERA and in opposing deregulation of airlines, but yet the civil rights movement is a political issue rather than an issue of significant community or moral consequences, that obviously goes against the modern morality that most of us would do when we say that the civil rights movement was one of the most important to societal justice and moral issues of the century, if not the most. And so a principle behind the practice approach kind of deduces that God doesn't agree with most of us about the civil rights movement. Otherwise, we would have expected the church to promote aspects of that movement in a way similar to opposing the ERA and promoting Proposition 8. You can see some of the anti-civil rights movement rhetoric of church leaders, evidence, for instance, in President Benson's speech about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "The man who is generally recognized as the leader of the so-called civil rights movement today in America is a man who has lectured at communist training school. He solicited funds through communist sources. He hired a communist as a top-level aide and affiliated with communist fronts. He's often praised in the communist press and has unquestionable parallels to the communist line. The same man advocates the breaking of the law and has been described by J. Edgar Hoover as the most notorious liar in the century." Also in a general conference address, President Benson, the address was called "Civil Rights, Tool of Communist Deception." He said, "Now there's nothing wrong with civil rights. It's what's being done in the name of civil rights that's alarming. There is no doubt that the so-called civil rights movement as it exists today," again this is 1967, "is used as a communist program for revolution in America." And he says not 1 in 1,000 Americans, black or white, really understands the full implications of today's civil rights agitation. The planning, direction, and leadership come from the communists, and most of those are white men who fully intend to destroy America. Along these lines, LDS Apostle Delbert Stapley, he wrote a letter to the namesake of my MPA program, who had taken a pro-civil rights position in Michigan. He was the Governor George Romney, and this letter was in 1964. Apostle Stapley wrote, "After listening to your talk on civil rights, I am very much concerned. I thought to drop you a note, not my official church position, but as a personal friend. When I reflect upon Joseph Smith's statements and remember what happened to 3 of our nation's presidents who were very active in the Negro cause, I am sobered by their demise. They went contrary to the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, and those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition and a feverish restlessness against the decrees of the Lord will learn, when perhaps it is too late for their own good, that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel." Apostle Stapley indicated that this promise has and will continue to be fulfilled. I continue to quote, "In this respect, let me give you a personal experience. A great champion of the colored race came to me after my call into the 12. and acknowledged President McKay to be a prophet of God. He wanted me to ask President McKay to inquire of the Lord to see if the Lord would not lift the curse from the colored race and give them the privileges of the priesthood. I explained to him that the Lord had placed the curse upon the Negro, which denied him the priesthood. Therefore, it was the Lord's responsibility, not man's, to change his decision. This friend of mine met a very tragic end by drowning. He was a most enthusiastic advocate of the colored cause and went about promoting for them all the privileges, social opportunities, and participation enjoyed by the whites. It is not right to force any class or race of people upon those of a different social order or race classification. People are happier when placed in the environment and association of like interests, racial instincts, habits, and natural groupings. I fully agree that the Negro is entitled to considerations, also stated above, but not full social benefits nor intermarriage privileges with the whites. Nor should the whites be forced to accept them into restricted white areas. In my judgment, the proposed Bill of Rights is vicious legislation. Principle, religious or otherwise, cannot be abrogated for political expediency. Now, don't think I'm against the Negro people because I have several in my employ. We must understand and recognize their status and then accordingly provide for them. I just don't think we can get around the Lord's position in relation to the Negro without punishment for our acts, going contrary to that which he has revealed. The Lord will not permit his purposes to be frustrated by man. Now we could go further into this example. Again, we're illustrating in this reason the perils of assuming a principle behind the practice, and we'll tie the relevance in here at the end. But some of the other areas we could look which substantiate this assertion would be the unequal status of women in Christ's church, both in former and modern times, their underrepresentation in Scripture, the replete Scripture references to God's wrath and anger, even though we're counseled to eschew those particular attributes, the changing stances of the church on evolution, the blood atonement that was practiced in the 19th and 20th century, the regular use of alcohol by church leaders in the 19th century, including Joseph Smith's lifelong consumption of alcohol, systematic lying, such as Joseph Smith's denial of his practicing of polygamy, dramatic changes in the temple ceremony, changes in church teachings about the moral permissibility of oral sex and birth control, church support of racial segregation, church support of discouraging interracial marriage, and the church's support of a race-based priesthood discrimination. So we could do a lot more. We're just going to take a quick look at that last bullet, which was the church's support of a race-based priesthood discrimination, and tie that into the relevance here. Okay, so the common sense principle behind the practice of denying black men the priesthood while giving it to white men is that God views them differently, that non-black men are viewed differently from black men. And so some conclude from this previously LDS practice that God is racist, as shown by the abundant paper trail that evidence racist teachings and practices by Christ's Latter-day Apostles. There's a lot of papers that kind of evidence that paper trail. Of course, these teachings are contrary to today's anti-racist sentiments. They're also arguably in contrast to 2 Nephi 26, which says that God denieth none that come unto him, black or white, bond or free, male or female, and that all are alike unto God. We know that God's impartial, no respecter of persons. In opposition to these scriptures, we see teachings such as Brigham Young's that says, if the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot, and this will always be so. Elder McConkie said, the whole Negro race have been cursed with the black skin, the mark of Cain. They can be identified as a caste apart, as a people with whom the other descendants of Adam should not intermarry. And then another one from Brigham Young that says, you see some classes of the human family, black, uncouth, uncomely, disagreeable, low in their habits. The Lord put a mark upon them, which is the flat nose and black skin. They will be the servants of servants, and will be all the way until the residue of Adam's children are brought up to that favorable position, and they cannot receive the first principles, the first ordinance of the priesthood. They were the first that were cursed. They will be the last from whom the curse will be removed. When the residue of the family of Adam come up and receive their blessing, then the curse will be removed from the seed of Cain, and they will receive blessings in like proportion. So that's the end of the quotes. Now, of course, the possibility exists that black-skinned and flat-nosed people were indeed cursed by God to be the servants of servants, and at some point between President Young's teaching and the present day, that most of us, that some way Brigham Young's statement has been fulfilled, and that all of Adam's other descendants have since received the priesthood keys before Negro people did. Of course, most of us find this conclusion unsavory and would instead say these were the ideas of men rather than coming from the Lord. But if the prohibition against blacks serving the priesthood were reviewed as merely a practice rather than a revealed principle, then presumably it would need no revelation to reverse it. If the principle were revelation, one has to wonder why an impartial God would share with his prophets the secret that black-skinned people are uncouth, deprived, unintelligent, undeserving of the priesthood. President Wilford Woodruff said, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program, it is not in the mind of God. If I were to attempt it, the Lord would remove me out of my place, and so he will any other man who attempts to lead the children of men astray from the oracles of God and from their duty." And of course, we could go into a greater discussion about the implications of this practice. President Benson taught that we encourage earthly knowledge in many areas, but remember, if there is ever a conflict between earthly knowledge and the words of the prophet, you stand with the prophet and you'll be blessed and time will vindicate you. So we could explain it, rather than saying that Brigham Young's prophecy was fulfilled, that we could say, well, maybe today's church is in apostasy because President Young was not removed out of his place, and the current position of the church clearly contradicts President Young's future predicting position. I don't really find that explanation very savory, and I think it kind of fails because today's president's also not removed out of his place. But the point is that we conclude that God is racist because of that racist practice. That illustrates the difficulty of inferring principles from practice. And so a lot of LDS members today oppose civil same-sex marriage because they believe that God has declared it to be immoral. It's not difficult to see why so many LDS members were apathetic or opposed to aspects of the civil rights movement, such as ending segregation, promoting legal equality, ending racism, because if God really is racist in both principle and prophetic precept, then you're on dangerous ground to promote the worldly view of social justice and racial equality. I, for one, am grateful that the worldly view won out. I tend to think of otherizing people as impure is one of the worst of vices. But you see systematically religions objectify others and otherize them. In fact, that stigmatization has been used to otherize Gentiles, Jews, and black people over time. Robert Rees, he said the following: "In reality, we can't accept the atonement until we are able to love those who, like ourselves, are undeserving of Christ's love. It is through loving others that we participate with God in the redemption of his children, and it is in being loved by others that we receive the power to seek redemption." Along similar lines, again, this is evidencing that hopefully the ideal of religion should be to do less otherizing rather than more, less objectifying, less making people them and making a we versus them mentality. Neil Maxwell said, "One of the things the gospel of Jesus Christ tells us is that our brotherhood with men on this planet is not a mere biological brotherhood, but a kind of brotherhood that lets me know that I have an accountability for my relationship that will be perpetuated far beyond today, far beyond here, far beyond now. I would submit to you that we cannot really forgive each other if our brotherhood is simply a biological brotherhood in which we share the same planet at the same time. The only kind of forgiveness that can operate effectively in the human family grows out of a sense of brotherhood that the gospel of Jesus Christ makes pervasive and persistent." Just two more of my favorite quotes and we'll move on. "Violence is not only what we do to the other, it is prior to that. Violence is the very construction of the other. Outside by definition, but always threatening to get in, the other is poised in a delicate balance that is always off balance because fear and aggression continually weight the scales. Identity forged against the other inspires perpetual policing of its fragile borders." So again, we see blacks versus whites, we see Gentiles versus Jews, we see same-sex versus opposite-sex couples, we see Mormons versus Baptists, etc. This construction of the other can be a type of spiritual violence. Howard Winters said, "Civilization is the process in which one gradually increases the number of people included in the term we or us, and at the same time decreases those labeled you or them until that category has no one left in it." Okay, so we see these religions policing these fragile borders of Jew or Gentile or race. And I think that we see in his moral ministry that Jesus passionately decried that very resistance to the unity of man. Now, and again, in regards to this racist policy with regards to the priesthood, some would ask whether or not these racist evidence statements by President Young and Elder McConkie and others were made over their pulpit. The fact that this inquiry never arises until a seemingly contrary statement crops up evidences the confirmation bias that's endemic to such a justification. People usually don't ask that question unless something comes up that they don't seem to like. And if you do conclude these statements were made by men that weren't in the role as prophets, then that really takes away the confidence you have in current pronouncements by church leaders, or reducing prophetic statements to sort of an impotent, if I like it, it's revelation, if I don't like it, it's because they're speaking as men. That's not really a foundation that we seem to like if we want to have confidence in the statements of church leaders. And of course, as you might imagine, a number of the statements, the homophobic statements, especially by church leaders, there's a hot debate. Some people want to dismiss those and say that it was just people speaking as men, and others want to uphold them. So it's definitely a difficult debate to resolve, but in any case, the church practice of forbidding homosexuals to marry each other does not necessarily imply that homosexual people are inferior, that homosexuality is inferior to heterosexuality, or that God will never open up to them the privilege of approved matrimony. Doctrine and Covenants 56 verse 4 says, I the Lord command and revoke as it seemeth me good. So that concludes this section that's same-sex marriage doesn't necessarily weaken marriage. And with that, we'll end this clip. And the next one will be reason number 19 to support LDS same-sex marriage because of its effects on increasing freedom.